So those chants reflect that. In addition to Janjian Azadi, protesters are saying, down with the Islamic Republic, death to the dictator. In fact, last night they set fire to Ayatollah Khomeini's childhood home, right? It's a complete rejection of authoritarian rule over the past 43 years that doesn't respect the most basic of human rights. I hesitate the language of regime change because for me that feels very imperial and really does feel in line with the war on terror and the remnants of those U.S. imperial projects. So I prefer to talk about this in terms of a revolutionary moment where Iranians on the streets are calling for a secular democracy that is predicated on human rights and women's rights more specifically.
Clearly there's dwindling support for the Islamic Republic regime, but there still remains a core group of supporters, people who worship the Ayatollah. So who are those people who have benefited from this regime that give it ongoing support? You've got the Republican Guards. They have economic power.
So this is really interesting. So I'm going to sort of answer this in two parts. So first, there's a question of why haven't there been sustained uprisings or call for a complete revolution, right? And so the reason I think that Iranians in the past have really focused on reformist movements and not calls for revolution or the overthrow of the government is because those previous revolutions lived through the trauma of the 1979 revolution, the subsequent founding of the Islamic Republic, right? And then the subsequent brutal 8-year Iran-Iraq war. And it's notable that the generation at the forefront of this feminist uprising are younger generations that don't have memories of that. And so I think previous revolutions previous generations still do carry the trauma of those moments and really fear that instability that comes in the wake of revolution, especially in a region that is pretty hostile to Iran. Iran doesn't have a lot of friends in the Middle East in this moment. And so I think there has been a lot of fear in the past about being vulnerable to that, as well as fear from seeing the struggles that Afghanistan and Iraq have had in the wake of regime change in those countries. In terms of supporters of the Islamic Republic, I think that there is a class that has benefited from the Islamic Republic staying in power. As you rightly know, the Revolutionary Guard, which controls huge swaths of the Iranian economy, have very much benefited from this. There's a clerical class that also benefits from this system of clerical rule. And I think Reza Aslan has made some really interesting comments over the past month about what would happen if clerics in Qom and Mashhad were to join in solidarity with the protests and gesturing to some discontent with the Islamic Republic right now. But to tell you the truth, I don't really know any regime supporters. I really can't speak to motivations other than that, other than to say that for friends and family and colleagues that I have in Iran, broadly, their reasons for not participating in protests prior to this moment has just been a deep fear of instability and also a fear of, once you have a revolution, who knows what comes next. And that's also, I think, something that many Iranians are talking about in this moment. This uprising is leaderless, which is different than previous, reformist movements. There's not a clear ideology behind this uprising other than this regime has to go. And I think that social movements do need time to kind of think about what their platforms are and envision new futures. But I think that that's worrying for folks who did live, who did experience pre-revolution and post-revolution, and who feel that the Islamic Republic was in fact worse than the Pahlavis, and a fear that maybe a worse form of government comes in. But again, I think it's important to continue to center the voices of protesters who I think are trying to envision radically new futures.
The Economist, which you cite with several co-authors, had a piece recently saying the female protesters who are burning their headscarves all across Iran liken themselves to gazelles crossing a river infested with crocodiles. Riot police may pick off many of them, they admit, but the herd will reach salvation. They will bait the regime and its security forces by dancing, baring their hair, and torching the ubiquitous posters of the reigning ayatollahs and generals. It's an interesting quote. Why did you choose to focus on it?
So that was an article that came out within the first few weeks of protests, and I think it struck me and my co-authors as just being a sort of deeply Orientalist hot take on the protests. I mean, first it uses very evocative language, comparing Iranian girls and women to gazelles, which feels very dehumanizing, almost a sort of frivolous way of describing their tactics for protest as dancing around crocodiles, and it just seems like a very absurdist way to describe the incredible courage and bravery of girls and women putting their bodies on the front line to demand revolutionary change. And I'm really heartened to see that some of U.S. media has instead begun to center the voices of protesters within the country, sometimes through statements or videos that are circulated through social media, at other times just focusing on their chants and their demands for what they want a future Iran to look like. But yes, I was very skeptical of sort of initial reports that were, one, misinterpreting important symbols of this moment, including the burning of hijab as somehow anti-Islamic, or two, really describing, I think, the girls and women in demeaning terms that don't center, again, their incredible bravery and courage in this moment, and lessons that we can learn from Iranian protesters in our own struggles within the U.S. For bodily autonomy and against police brutality.
How will U.S. people, Canadians, Europeans, how can they express their solidarity with what's going on, but not hearkening back to a pre-colonial structure?
That's such an important question, and one that I continue to grapple with, because as a feminist scholar and an activist, I've spent much of my adult life writing against U.S. and European imperialism in this region. And I think it's important to really take seriously what solidarity from within the U.S., especially given over 4 decades of Cold War tensions, have looked like between these two countries. And so I think first and foremost, what's really important is to keep the visibility firmly focused on Iran. I think U.S. media has a tendency to just sort of focus on something for a very short amount of time and then move on if there isn't sort of spectacular, hyper-visible forms of either revolutionary change or violence. And I think that would be a mistake. And when I did my fieldwork in Iran, one of the statements I heard often in interviews about the Green Movement and other forms of environmental and feminist protest was, once the U.S. media stopped covering the Green Movement protests, that's when violence against protesters and the crackdown really intensified. So first and foremost, I think solidarity means continuing to have these conversations, and protesters really need our support. The second thing is to, again, continue to center the voices of what Iranians within the country are demanding and really be skeptical of political agendas being read onto the protests. We have to be very careful about that. There's ongoing conversations and discussions around how to keep the Islamic Republic accountable for vast human rights violations. And one of those tools is sanctions. And so that has caused quite a lot of debate because on one hand, broad-based sanctions has had devastating impacts for Iranians within the country. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone in the Iranian diaspora whose family hasn't suffered, irrespective of class, from these sanctions. I mean, speaking from personal experience, I had 2 uncles pass away in the past 5 years because they didn't have access to adequate medicine, and the health infrastructure has certainly been deeply impacted through sanctions, which was worse than through the COVID pandemic. And so that's just one example of sort of these devastating humanitarian impacts of sanctions. But I think there's an argument that can be made about targeted sanctions against regime officials. And what that would look like is the freezing of assets of those associated with the regime, travel bans, etc. There's also been calls for countries to recall ambassadors from Iran, as well as temporary closures of Iranian embassies globally. And there's also been a number of folks within the diaspora in the U.S. that have focused on tech. And so one of the impacts of U.S. sanctions against Iran is barriers to getting certain forms of technology. So, for example, there has been issues with accessing cloud-based technology that can be important for subverting the Islamic regime's surveillance of different apps and forms of social media. So there's been urgent calls to lift those sanctions. There have been calls to expand, for example, Tor networks or this platform called Snowflake that would allow protesters to be able to upload images and footage of human rights violations happening in real time. So tech support is also part of these calls for solidarity. So I think everyone's sort of brainstorming in the moment ways that folks can show solidarity throughout the globe, but not use language like regime change, Western intervention, etc. And then finally, there are calls for engagement at the level of the international community. For example, Iran inexplicably is still part of the UN Commission of Women, which that membership should be evoked immediately. The UN Security Council, that's very problematic, but we can think about at least, condemnations from the United Nations. I think many of those questions are really complicated, given 4 decades of threats of regime change from Western powers in Iran.
But on the issue of the sanctions and their extremely punitive measures, it gives the regime a bludgeon to beat the population. So look what they're doing to you. You don't have food for your kids. You don't have medicine for your parents. They're sick. So it's actually a weapon. It's something that has been weaponized by the regime to maintain its power.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that there are many critiques about the maximum pressure campaign and the way that the regime has used that as an excuse to cover corruption and economic mismanagement. And so, the other part of this is the U.S. has sanctioned Iran in so many areas. There's not really any more room to sanction anything else. So I think we need to one, think about how targeted sanctions against regime officials might help with that accountability, but also at the same time think about how U.S. foreign policy or European foreign policy, which is often framed through the language of respecting Iranian human rights, can oftentimes worsen human rights conditions within the country and be really strategic and thoughtful and intentional about how foreign policy can support protesters as opposed to worsen conditions within the country. And it's a very tricky and complicated question.
The kind of anthem of the movement, the uprising, is a song called Baraye, because of sung by Shervin Hajipur. Apparently it's a series of text messages or tweets.
I love the song by Shervin Hajipur, who has unfortunately been detained, and there's a number of Iranian artists that have, contributed to this moment through anthems or songwriting. Actually, one of the first protesters condemned to death is an Iranian Kurdish rapper who now has a death sentence for expressing solidarity with protesters. But this particular song, Baraye, because of or for, was Hajipur collecting tweets from Iranians about why they are deciding to protest. And I'll just read a few of the tweets that are encapsulated in the song. One of the first ones, feels very emotional to read, but it's Baraye, or four embarrassed fathers with empty hands. And so I think this really gestures to the extreme economic precarity that has impacted the vast majority of Iranians, for yearning for a normal life. And I think this speaks to, Asaf Bayat, an Iranian academic, has written about this movement as reclaiming life, and talks about the colonization of everyday life, and the denial of sort of normal pleasures by an elderly patriarchal clerical class. And so this yearning for a normal life, I think, really resonates with many Iranians, especially young ones. For the dictatorial economy, also gesturing towards grievances. For this polluted air, many folks in the U.S. are unfamiliar with all of the environmental justice movements that have taken place over the past decade, and how that intersects with economic grievances as well as socio-political rights. And then this one tweet for the dumpster diving boy and his dreams. And so I love that he brought together all of these tweets, these really heartfelt tweets about why people are risking their lives, gesturing to the hopelessness of life if this regime stays in power, but the hopefulness of this intersectional feminist uprising that really is centering dreams of a normal life that has been denied to Iranians for over 4 decades.
I didn't quite understand the environmental section you had.
Oh yes. So one of the tweets that Hajipur uses in Baraye is for this polluted air. So I think it's probably talking about the very polluted air within Tehran, but I think it also gestures towards, in addition to the labor rights movements and feminist movements and civil rights movements that have happened over the past decade, there's also been a number of environmental justice movements within the country, many of which that are concentrated in ethnic minority communities. So in Ahvaz, which has a sizable Arab Iranian population, there have been protests over the past several years, many that are women-led, with slogans that they can't breathe because of the polluted air. We can think about in Esfahan, for example, drought-stricken farmers that were uniting with protesters in 2017 and 2019 about water scarcity and how this has contributed to economic grievances because of the lack of protection for environmental resources. And so when I hear him sing about polluted air, I think about how environmental grievances have gendered, class, and ethnic impacts within the country. And this latest uprising is also building on environmental justice movements within the country that are, again, not very visible to Euro-American audiences, but are really important within the context of thinking about this important part of women life freedom. Like, what is life? Life is not just socio-political rights and civil rights, but life is also water and food and land, and these also deserve attention in this uprising.
If you close your eyes for a moment, is another Iran possible? What would it look like?
Oh, absolutely. I have complete faith in Iranians to envision a radically new future, one that is based on respect for human rights, democratic principles. It's such a rich country with such an incredibly long and rich history. And, for those that have had the opportunity to travel to Iran, and I know, David, you've traveled there, you know that it's a country that is so culturally rich, from beautiful architecture to a long history of poetry, intellectual thought, philosophy, medical advancements, astronomy. It's really been the epicenter of really important civilizational shifts, and remains, one of the most highly educated populations in the world. A lot of U.S. audiences don't know this, but I've traveled throughout the Middle East, and Iran is the most pro-American country that I've ever been in the Middle East, because of course the population is not represented by its government, and I just think with this richness of culture, and also with this rich history of having social movements. Just think about the 1906 Constitutional Revolution. That was envisioning a free and democratic Iran more than 100 years ago. And so I absolutely have faith that eventually this regime will fall, and that if given the space and time, that Iranians will create this beautiful country that I think we've all been yearning for, despite these numerous interruptions from without in terms of imperialist interventions and from within by despotic regimes. And I absolutely have faith in these young, courageous girls that are articulating this on a daily basis, and that gives me so much hope. Zan, Zendegi, Azadi.
Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me, David.
You were just listening to Marie Ranjbar, Iran, Zan, Zendegi, Azadi, Woman, Life, Freedom. I talked with her on November 18th in the studios of KGNU in Boulder, Colorado. Marie Ranjbar is an assistant professor in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Her research examines social movements in Iran. This program is produced by Alternative Radio based in Boulder, Colorado. We are an independent nonprofit in our 37th year. We're supported solely by individuals just like you. We feature voices rarely heard in the corporate media, such as Vijay Prashad, Chris Hedges, Angela Davis, Arundhati Roy, and Tariq Ali. To access our complete audio and book catalog, just go to our website, alternativeradio.org. Again, our website where we are podcasting, alternativeradio.org. To order copies of today's program, Marie Ranjbar on Iran, Zan, Zendegi, Azadi, Woman, Life, Freedom, and for Noam Chomsky's book, Notes on Resistance, just give us a call, 1-800-444-1977. That's 1-800